Well, the situation in Ukraine is escalating at a pace that would be alarming to many in the West. Australia, along with a number of allies, have imposed sanctions on Russia. On Sky News today, we've looked at this story from every angle, from the plight of those in Ukraine to the long-term geopolitical consequences of Putin's aggression. But of course, conflict of this nature can also have grave economic consequences. Joining me now is Sky Business Editor Ross Greenwood. Ross, thank you for your time. How have the markets reacted to the invasion thus far?
Look, as soon as the news came through of Russia going into Ukraine, it really was immediate. The Australian stock market down 3%. It had been down even more at one stage. But even then, the futures markets, which sort of give us a hint as to what might come tomorrow, have also been down almost as much again. So this is a pretty big sell-off of the Australian market. It'll be interesting to see what happens when Wall Street opens tonight, because that clearly will be the barometer for the rest of the world. It appears as though it might be just a little bit more muted in terms of its response as compared with other parts of the world. Asian markets have been down. So, look, what happens in Ukraine with Russia going through its border really does have repercussions around the world. And Australia is certainly not alone in what's taking place, even though we are a long, long way away and don't necessarily have the immediate and direct economic consequences as a result of that action.
Well, we're already seeing the cost of fuel is soaring. It's set to soar further. Russia is the world's third largest oil producer. How much higher are prices going to go, Ross, potentially?
Well, it can go higher, and that has other consequences, of course, because the fact that Brent crude today went through $100 US a barrel really did also potentially have an impact on those financial markets, because really if costs are rising, that means fuel costs are rising, then ultimately that can slow down Western economies. So already many people will be paying around or more than $2 a litre for fuel. This latest increase could be another 10% on top of that. So it could well be that while petrol prices in recent times have been peaking around about $1.85 a litre, they could well, for just the standard unleaded, be above $2 a litre. Now, the interesting part about this is, you know, it's going to be then an inflationary impact on that, Rita, because as soon as you get higher petrol prices, you get higher cost of living. You get higher cost of living and inflation, you get more pressure for central banks to raise interest rates even higher than what they were going to anyway. So you see, nothing is alone. Everything is connected, and it has a knock-on impact.
And that's why we love speaking to you, because you tell us about all these connections and how it impacts every household, not just big business, but every single household. But Australia and Japan have today pledged to tap their oil reserves if needed. How viable is that strategy? And if this conflict continues for a prolonged period, is that something that's going to have any sort of impact?
Well, the market response probably comes from the Middle East and the Saudi Arabians, who are the largest producers of oil, and certainly oil that can be used to produce our petrol. Of course, these days we have two oil refineries that can produce petrol, one in Geelong, the other one in Brisbane, the Lytton refinery owned by Ampol, and so they can produce a certain amount, but we rely very much on the trade routes between here and Singapore for our oil. Now, the other thing also that is all wrapped up in all of this is the Australian dollar. Because the Australian dollar is so low, sitting around 72 US cents right now, normally when oil prices are as high as they are, $100 a barrel, that you've got iron ore prices, $135 US a tonne, you'd expect the Australian dollar to be 90 or 95 US cents. It's not. It's 72 US cents. And so that's adding to the cost of imports. And so really your fuel price is high, not just because of the high price of oil, it's partly that, but also because of the very low Australian dollar. And the Australian dollar is low mainly because the Reserve Bank has kept our interest rates so low. It's almost a deliberate attempt to actually encourage our exporters to discourage imports and indeed to make imports more expensive. But the problem is that's all adding to our inflation story and is potentially going to put more pressure ultimately on the Reserve Bank to raise rates. So the interesting thing is that New Zealand has raised rates 3 times. Their rates are now at 1%, the central bank's official cash rate. rate. Here, though, it's still 0.1%. So technically, a tenth where our near neighbour New Zealand is. This is, if you like, again, where all of this conflict in Ukraine actually affects us here in Australia through the economics of what happens to oil prices, inflation and interest rates.
Well, I wonder if there is an opportunity here with our low Australian dollar to export gas to Europe. Certainly back in January, that was something the Biden administration was considering. An official revealed that the US was looking at the global flow of liquefied natural gas from the US or Australia, they said, or other places. Is that an opportunity for Australia to export gas to Europe that's become so reliant on Russia?
The answer is no. Absolutely, it will not happen. Now, some of it might find its way there, but I'll explain this to you, Rita. So our big gas producers are Woodside. There's also Shell. There's obviously the Northwest Shelf. There's the Ichthys project as well, up towards the Northern Territory. Now, these are giant gas projects, there's no doubt. But most of their gas is already contracted to Southeast Asia. So I'm thinking about Korea here, Japan, China to a certain extent. And so really there's not a lot. Now, because of the record gas prices right now, these big oil companies, including Santos and Woodside, would like to have what's known as spot oil, or spot gas rather. So in other words, that they could take advantage of these very high prices. But there's another problem. While Australia is either the first or the second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, the largest is in Qatar. Now, Qatar is much closer to Europe, and to be able to even find ships to get to Europe with gas if they desperately needed it would really be near on impossible right now. So, A, it's economically better to get that gas into Europe if it's going to happen that way from Qatar. Secondly, Australia would probably be priced out of that market almost immediately. So, while it's a nice idea to be able to help Europe, because of course they have also said as a part of the action against Russia that the second pipeline worth $16 billion that was set to be open between Russia going underneath the Baltic Sea and into Europe is not going to be commissioned, is not going to be open for the time being to hurt Russia. Really, the answer is not in Australia. Though it sounds great, it just ain't going to fly.
Oh, that's why we need you to set us straight and set the Biden administration straight, because they're the ones who floated that idea. And finally, we know petrol prices are soaring and going to get worse, but what about electricity and gas? Are we going to have an impact there for households as well as businesses?
Well, the answer is potentially yes. And the reason for it is because we know the east coast of Australia already has a gas shortage. And this is partly because governments like the Victorian government have not allowed onshore gas exploration for many years. That's led to the shortfall of gas. And indeed, if there were spare gas in Western Australia that wasn't already committed, it's likely that that gas would come to the east coast of Australia. And in fact, people like Twiggy Forrest have actually suggested that coming into Port Kembla to basically drop gas off to go into the east coast grid. Now, the point is also that given the fact that there are early closures of coal-fired power stations, to replace those, you're going to need gas-fired power stations. That means you need gas at a cheap enough price to not put upward pressure on electricity. Now, that is a longer-term problem, not a short-term problem, but even the gas-fired power stations that are there now need gas, need to have reliable supply, and need to have it cheap. And so if there's anything out there that pushes up the price of gas, that makes those electricity generators less viable than what they probably would have previously seemed. And that is, again, a part of the mix of where costs can rise as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, which just simply raises gas prices all around the world.